Friends, the ongoing Iran war has delivered a strong shock to global energy markets. Oil prices have crossed $100 per barrel. This is happening for the first time since 2022. If this war continues in the same way, it will not be surprising if oil prices reach $120 per barrel or even higher. This is because oil production has been directly hit due to the war. Iran's infrastructure has been attacked. Iran's oil storage facilities, where millions of liters of oil were stored, have been hit. After the attacks, fires broke out in these facilities. Terrifying pictures and videos are circulating on social media. They show massive flames rising high into the sky. Thick black smoke can be seen rising everywhere. The situation has become so serious that oil is literally raining down in some areas. The entire environment has been polluted. Black smoke has covered the entire sky. Iran is also taking revenge. It is retaliating. It is carrying out attacks on the Gulf region. Several Gulf countries' oil storage facilities, depots, and infrastructure have been hit. Because of this, production had to be shut down. Now, if production is cut, supply will fall. However, global demand is still high. So what will happen next? Prices will increase. That is exactly what is happening. Many Gulf countries are also reducing production because trade routes have been disrupted. During the war, when missiles and drones are flying around, how will you export oil? So a crisis has emerged in the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important oil choke points in the world. Around 20% of the world's oil supply moves through this narrow sea route. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and the UAE depend on this route. They export their oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, during the war, there is a risk that missiles and drones could hit oil tankers. This is why oil tankers are avoiding this route out of fear. Maritime traffic in this region has drastically declined. Because of safety concerns, ships have even stopped coming near this area. Many oil tankers have changed their routes. Hundreds of oil tankers are waiting outside the Gulf. They are waiting for the situation to improve. Insurance premiums for ships have increased significantly. A slowdown is being seen in global oil shipments. Within just 1 week of the start of this war, the entire global energy market has been shaken. Considering the current problems and future risks, stock markets around the world are collapsing. Oil prices are rising further due to fears that the war could spread. This war began on February 28 when Israel and the US launched joint attacks on Iran. In just 8 days, oil prices have increased by more than 60%. You may remember the 2022 energy crisis after the Ukraine war began. This situation is even more serious than that. All countries are worried about this. Because when oil prices rise, the entire global economy is affected. If energy becomes expensive, the fuel becomes costly, transportation becomes expensive. When transportation becomes expensive, the price of all goods increases. As when transporting goods becomes costly, the prices of those goods rise. Consequently, a massive wave of inflation will be seen. To control inflation, central banks will step in. They will increase interest rates. When interest rates increase, borrowing will decline. Investments will decrease. Economic slowdown will be seen. Economic instability will emerge in many countries. The reason why financial markets around the world are reacting sharply is because they are taking these risks into account. Look, the simple fact is that the entire global economy is controlled by energy choke points. If any tension occurs there, it affects the entire world. If the war continues in the same way and attacks on tankers continue, oil fields and refineries will keep shutting down. And if the flow of oil remains heavily disrupted, global inflation will rise sharply. The costs of airlines, shipping, and manufacturing will skyrocket. A bloodbath will be seen in stock markets. A dramatic slowdown will be seen in the economies of the entire world. We have seen such economic slowdowns before in 1973, 2008, etc. The risk of it happening again has increased. Countries like India, which import the majority of their oil, will be the worst affected. More than 40% of India's energy passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, This disruption in energy will hit India's economy very hard. Prices of petrol, diesel, and gas will rise. The rupee will depreciate and inflation will increase. Fiscal stress on the government will rise. Public resentment will emerge. This could create political instability. This war started because of the strategic blunder of the American regime. There was actually no need for it. Iran was at the negotiating table. It had agreed to offer unprecedented concessions. However, under pressure from Israel, the US ignored all of this. It underestimated Iran and took a miscalculated step. Now the entire world is facing the consequences of it. We are moving close to one of the biggest energy shocks in modern history. The risk of a global recession is increasing. Because of one ill-informed decision, many countries may now face an economic crisis. History exists to teach us lessons. When we ignore history, situations like this arise. Historically, we know that oil shocks have triggered global recessions. Therefore, before creating tensions in a major oil-producing region like West Asia, should this not have been carefully considered? Because of a bad decision, instability has emerged in such an important region. One of the most critical choke points has been disrupted. Therefore, it is obvious that energy markets will now be dangerously affected. Even the US will not be able to escape this. Many problems will begin to emerge within the US as well. Fuel, transportation, and food will all become expensive. At the same time, America's biggest strategic rivals, China and Russia, will be in a better position. Compared to the US, they will suffer less damage from this crisis. China had already signed long-term energy deals with Iran, Russia, and the Gulf states. It has made long-term contracts, strategically planning for the future. This will protect China from sudden price fluctuations. In addition, China has built huge petroleum reserves. These strategic reserves can provide China with coverage for several months. With the help of these reserves, China can handle oil supply shocks more effectively. However, Europe's situation will be very bad. After the Ukraine war began in 2022, Europe cut off its energy ties with Russia under pressure from the US. European countries rejected cheap Russian energy and shifted to expensive alternatives. Now, when disruptions are also emerging in Middle Eastern oil supplies, European countries will face severe inflation. They will face an economic slowdown. When Western economies become weaker, China's relative economic power will increase. China will definitely also face some impact. However, its rivals will suffer even more than it does. This situation has largely been created by Western countries themselves, and they will suffer the most here. Europe has still not fully recovered from the energy crisis that emerged after the Ukraine war. It is still recovering from the energy shock. Now it is facing another problem. Energy supplies from the Middle East may also become unstable. This has created an energy vulnerability. Europe does not have sufficient domestic oil resources. It is heavily dependent on imported energy. Therefore, the risk of inflation from supply shocks has increased there. The coming economic stagnation could create serious political instability in Europe. That is why we are now seeing some voices emerging inside Europe that are opposing American and Israeli actions. It is not that their humanity has suddenly awakened. They have started speaking because they see damage to their own economic interests. When Gaza was being flattened, they remained silent. They were silent during events in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. They were silent everywhere. They were silent when Maduro was abducted from Venezuela. But when the issue of Greenland emerged, they suddenly stood up together in one voice. So the issue is about interests. When people's own interests are affected, they start speaking. Western countries do not have a problem with their years of colonialism. That is because they benefited from it. However, during the Ukraine war and the Iran war, they are facing losses. When their own losses appear and their own economies are hit, they start speaking. That is exactly what is happening. Russia and China did not even need to do anything. Western countries have effectively harmed themselves. Russia and China are now simply sitting back and watching. They are providing intelligence support to Iran. They are trying to make the American operation impossible. At the same time, they are gaining strategic benefits. Now the demand for Russian oil is at all-time high. Discussions have started about removing sanctions on Russian oil. The US has also given India a 30-day waiver so that global oil markets can stabilize. This is intended to ensure that oil continues to flow. As a result, Russian oil has once again become highly demanded. Russia will benefit from this situation. China will receive oil from Russia. China will also benefit. So who will suffer the most? The US and Europe. America's military-industrial complex may gain from the war. However, ordinary people will suffer. Economies like India, which are highly sensitive to oil prices, will also suffer. Therefore, in this entire crisis, China and Russia currently hold a relative strategic advantage. Now, looking at the risks that are emerging, India is saying that the conflict should be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. India is calling for negotiation instead of escalation. India is doing this because it faces a direct risk. India's import bill will increase. Inflation will rise. During the Russia-Ukraine crisis, India received discounted oil from Russia. However, the crisis that is emerging in West Asia will harm India. Here, India will have to buy expensive oil. This will hurt its economy. This conflict is completely different. It will directly hit India's economy. Slowly, the time is coming when India may need to rethink its long-standing foreign policy. India maintains relations with multiple rival powers. India tries to avoid getting involved in any conflict. But when we clearly see violations of international law, when we see clear bullying by an aggressor, at that moment, remaining neutral can mean indirectly supporting the aggressor. Countries should not wait for the day when their own turn comes. They should not wait until they themselves become the target. If something wrong is happening with any country anywhere in the world, and if international law is being violated, all countries should unite and take a stand against it. Because nothing meaningful can be expected from the United Nations in such situations. When a powerful country violates international law, the United Nations is completely ineffective. It is a dysfunctional organization. Therefore, countries themselves must come together and stand against wrongdoing. Otherwise, such violations will continue to repeat. Because of the wrong actions of a few selected countries, the entire world will suffer. This has happened before in history. It is happening even today. It will continue to happen in the future if it is not stopped. By maintaining a neutral stance and strategic silence, we can only carefully observe the situation. We can watch what is happening. However, if we want to change things, intervention will be required. A clear stand will have to be taken. Clear red lines will have to be drawn. Otherwise, this kind of bullying and impunity will continue. We need a fair global order where rules are the same for everyone. We need a system where there are no double standards and no hypocrisy. We need a system where powerful countries cannot break the rules whenever they want. Today, leaders are openly saying that they will flatten others. They are openly talking about capturing foreign oil. Their intentions are very clear. This is a struggle for resource control. However, it is repeatedly given different names. It is being described in different ways today. At such a time, the world is silently watching. The more silent people remain against an aggressor and a bully, the more their actions become reinforced. When the issue eventually affects you, you will have to speak. If speaking up is inevitable sooner or later, then it is better to start doing it now. Why wait for that day?